Good evening. I am Kelsey Bush, the moderator for this evening's panel, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. 60 years might seem like a long time ago for some, but as they say, time and even age is relative. We have put together an outstanding panel for tonight's discussion. Before I introduce them, I would like to take a moment to recite the St. Mary's Land Acknowledgement and Pledge, which signifies this institution's dedication to the tenets of the Civil Rights Act, to treat all with dignity and equity. We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Yakamiko and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partially built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. Thank you. Now I will introduce our esteemed panel members, starting with Dr. Janice Walthour, retired educator, political activist, and poet. Next, Michael Kent, historian, author, and semi-retired attorney. Next, Peter Landros is a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe and is supported by Chief Mark Tyak of the Piscataway Indian Nation. He is the regional president of the American Indian Movement and advocates for a range of issues, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. He also promotes cultural events such as traditional socials and powwows, recently assisting Bowie State University with its inaugural powwow. At this time, Peter Friesen from Historic St. Mary's City has a presentation.
Gifts of tobacco and turkey feathers for you and for Chief Mark Tyak. Thank you for coming and speaking to us about your history, your culture as it relates to the Civil Rights Act.
Oh. This is a traditional way of greeting and giving thanks and honoring people for what I'm here to do today. The tobacco at one point in time was like a currency, the Piscataway Indian Nation. So it's an honor to be gifted with it. The turkey feather holds a high honor to the Piscataway Nation and the Piscataway people. So again, this is an honor that I accept very humbly and respectfully say thank you. And when I say I hope, it means thank you or amen.
All right. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Dennis Doster, head of the Black History Program, a unit of Prince George's County Department of Parks and Recreation of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Chuck Holden, a distinguished history professor at St. Mary's College of Maryland. His extensive knowledge, and particularly in the history of the Civil Rights Movement, will provide us with a comprehensive overview of the previous Civil Rights Act and the final passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Thank you, Kelsey. Good evening, everyone. This is going to be a very short history lesson. We're going to cover a lot of ground here in a short period of time, so here we go. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the legal status of the formerly enslaved was still shrouded in uncertainty. Lincoln, in the last year of his life, and the anti-slavery Republicans in Congress understood that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had been a wartime order. What now would become of those not emancipated by the Union Army by the time the war ended? It was this legal gray area that the 13th Amendment sought to address in 1865 and 66. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but what would freedom mean? To try and answer this question, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, an attempt to define citizenship and to assert in law that the rights of all are equally protected under the law. The main passage of the act is found at the beginning, which says all persons born in the United States are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. The act also spells out in considerable detail what all would constitute violations of this law. But the problems the leaders of Congress realized almost right away was that passing a law was one thing, enforcing it was another. The violent resistance to African American freedom in the former Confederacy signaled to leaders of Congress that more needed to be done. This led to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment uses much of the same language of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 in Section 1, quote, all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. It says further, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. With the Civil Rights Act of 1875, Congress weighed in on the issue of equal access to public accommodations, transportation, inns, restaurants. This new law required, quote, that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, or other places of public amusement, applicable alike to all citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. You might have noticed when I was reading the text of the 14th Amendment a minute ago that I was emphasizing the word state. In 1883, a conservative Supreme Court ruled in what is called the civil rights cases that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional because the acts named in the statute were considered private acts of individuals, a restaurant owner refusing to serve an African American customer, not acts of a state. Therefore, it failed the test of a 14th Amendment violation according to this narrow, what today we would call textualist reading. The court's position in the civil rights cases then paved the way in the 1890s for the full-on creation of the Jim Crow South, a project that over about 20 years sought to codify right into law segregation and to create a two-tiered system of rights for white and black Southerners. This was done most notoriously in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. In Plessy, the court ruled that a Louisiana law mandating separate railroad cars according to race did not violate the 14th Amendment. Even though in this case it was a state action, it did not run afoul of the 14th Amendment, they said, as long as the standard was, quote, separate but equal. But even here, the mask slipped from the court's textualism. The court also added in its ruling that the 14th Amendment, quote, could not have been intended to abolish distinctions upon color or to enforce a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. In other words, the Louisiana law would be upheld because it prevented black and white passengers from using the same railroad car out of concern that one party might find the commingling unsatisfactory. Even at the time of the Plessy ruling, the black community knew that separate but equal would quickly become a legal fiction. They'd get separate all right, but they wouldn't be holding their breath for the equal part of that ruling anytime soon. The next significant effort by Congress to weigh in on civil rights doesn't come until 1957 under the Eisenhower administration. As we pick up the story here, the context of World War II has to be factored in. The country's effort against a violent, racist regime like Hitler's Germany empowered African American leaders to hammer home the hypocrisy of fighting a racist nation abroad while tolerating racism at home. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP said in 1944 that it was Hitler who, and I'm quoting, jammed our white people into their logically untenable position. Forced to oppose him for the sake of the life of the nation, they were jockeyed into declaring against his racial theories, here's the key word, publicly. For the moment, Wilkins continued, the United States had to say, quote, down with Hitlerism, down with the master race theory, away with racial bigotry. As the white South went deeper into a defensive crouch regarding segregation in the post-World War II years, NAACP attorneys like Thurgood Marshall, Charles Houston, continued to bring forward a series of court cases that demonstrated the legal fiction that Plessy had been all along. This, of course, culminated in Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. With the NAACP having compiled a mountain of evidence over the years of the inequities, the disparities between black and white schools, the court ruled 9-0 that separate but equal was unconstitutional. A landmark, sweeping decision, or so it seemed. The court in Brown did not offer any guidance as to how or when states were to dismantle the segregated school systems. When asked to clarify in 1955, the court basically stepped aside. In the case known as Brown 2, the court's guidance was that the schools should desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. A few places, St. Mary's County being one, established plans to gradually, slowly desegregate. But other places, Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, in 1957, resisted bitterly and violently attempts to integrate their schools. In the midst of this, 1955, 56, 57, the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, this is the story of Rosa Parks and a young Martin Luther King Jr., successfully used the logic of the Brown decision regarding schools and applied it to the end of the back of the bus seating ordinances in Montgomery. The Brown decision, the Montgomery bus boycott, also prompted massive resistance in the South, the formation of white citizens' councils, the hideous murder of Emmett Till. Alarm at the violent resistance, even to this level of movement against Jim Crow, prompted Congress to pass a new Civil Rights Act in 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 created a Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, as well as the Civil Rights Commission. It created a new Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. But the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was watered down by conservative Southern members of Congress. For instance, they removed a provision that would have authorized the Justice Department to enforce the Brown versus Board ruling. Congress took another bite at the apple in 1960. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 gave some federal authority to oversee free and fair elections, but it was not nearly enough. The process for initiating federal action against voting obstruction was overly complicated, for example. The act also seemed to sidestep the wide range of other civil rights abuses at the time. But perhaps the most positive legacy was that the Civil Rights Act of 1960 required election officials to, quote, retain and preserve voting records. Election officials were then required to produce those records upon request by the Attorney General. Attorneys General William Rogers of the outgoing Eisenhower administration and Bobby Kennedy of the new John F. Kennedy administration began doing just that. This evidence became important as providing evidentiary basis for remedies found in both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Which brings me to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Since the beginning of that decade, the country had witnessed a sit-in at Greensboro, James Meredith integrating Ole Miss and the violent reaction to his presence there, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the unrest in Cambridge and the Eastern Shore, Bull Connor and fire hoses and attack dogs, the murder of 4 little girls in the Birmingham church bombing, the March on Washington. John Kennedy, perhaps belatedly, came around. His administration proposed a new Civil Rights Act in June of 1963. It was sent to the House Judiciary Committee, where the details were hammered out over the course of the summer. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 and Lyndon Johnson's almost immediate linking of the bill's passage to honor the memory of the late president gave it considerable momentum going into 1964. Both houses, after a 75-day filibuster in the Senate, passed the final bill on June 19th, and President Johnson signed it into law on July 2nd. The bill had bipartisan support, but the voting fell heavily along sectional lines. 92% of Northern senators voted yes, 90% of Northern members of the House voted yes. 92% of Southern House members voted no, 95% of Southern senators voted no. Of the Maryland delegation, all members, Republican and Democrat, voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act, with the exception of one House member who voted present, Congressman Langford of the 5th District, where we are. There are 11 parts or titles of the final bill, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll summarize them very briefly here. The final bill addressed the disparities of voter registration requirements that had been used to disfranchise black voters for decades. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 would strengthen access to voting even more. The bill outlawed discrimination in public accommodations and called for desegregation of public facilities. It explicitly now called for the desegregation of public schools and gave the Attorney General authority to file suit toward those ends. The final bill reaffirmed the Civil Rights Commission of the 1957 Act and expanded its powers. Title VI established that an organization or institution receiving federal funds could not discriminate without risk of losing those federal funds. The final bill established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and in the same part of the bill also prohibited employment discrimination on basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The final bill expanded the collection of voter registration data by the Civil Rights Commission. It made it easier to remove civil rights cases from state courts to federal courts. In the end, it was a sweeping bill. Dr. King himself referred to it as a, quote, second emancipation. And with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists for their local recollections. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, for that insightful historical overview. To bring a local perspective to the discussion, I invite first Janice, then Michael, and then Peter. If you could share some personal experiences and observations of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay. Well, I based some of the conversation I wanted to have with you all tonight, with the panel, on in 1964. That was the year I graduated from high school. And I went to, of course, an all-black high school, and it was George Washington Carver. It was Jarbotsville at first, which was a Navy dormitory, and it had been gifted to the Board of Education to open the second high school for African Americans in St. Mary's County. We had Banneker, which there's a lot of history about the schools, and a book that I was a part of, the Unified Committee for Afro-American Contributions, and it talks about In Relentless Pursuit of an Education, African American Stories from a Century of Segregation from 1865 to 1968. and there's a lot of information about the schools prior to desegregation. And so 1964, I was still in a segregated system. I also went to, from St. Mary's County, we all, the black students, went to the historically black colleges, Bowie State, Morgan State, University of Maryland, Princess Anne, we called it Princess Anne. I went to Morgan State, and but came back home to teach, and that was in about I graduated in 68, came back that year, and things were wide open for African Americans. Now, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and of course, Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954, and we were doing all deliberate speed, which meant slow. So we had not really moved forward that much until that Civil Rights Act. And one thing about St. Mary's County public schools, they really try to follow the law. If they say move slow, we'll move slow. If they say you better get it right. So, but when all of this came about, the Act of 64, and then they really, I think, started to embrace that act, especially around 1967, when I came back home. My sister and I have a sister, we both are in education. But right away, I got a job, and they had a Title I summer school. I worked in the summer school, got a job in the school system, was a teacher at Lexington Park Elementary. So I think the doors were open because they knew they had to be open. The law said it, so we got involved. We were able to get jobs right back at home. I have more, but I know you want to move.
Very good. Michael?
Okay, I'm next. I'm Michael Kent. I'm one of those locals whose family has been in the same place for generations and generations. There was a doctoral student who did a thesis, his doctoral thesis in Calvert County on the people of Calvert County in 1970. And in 1970, he found that 97% of the people living in Calvert County, that their grandparents had been born in Calvert County, which takes them back to the Civil War era. During that time, Calvert was a Southern sympathizer. They did not go with the South, but they were Southern sympathizers. We know that because during the first election in 1860, I was able to check the election rolls. Of course, only white men could vote, but Abraham Lincoln received 1 vote from Calvert County. In the second election in 1864, he outdid himself. He doubled that to 2 votes. Okay. So we knew what their attitude was going to be in Calvert County when they wanted to integrate the school system. And for Calvert County, all deliberate speed meant as long as it took us to build another school for all white kids. So that was Calverton School that was built in 1967, and that's when Calvert County was decided to integrate all the schools, when they had another option for the white kids. So at that time, in 1964, I was should have been 3rd grade at that time, in a segregated school, Mount Hope School. I didn't know all the things that I learned later as to why things were the way they were. I did see the whites-only signs. The transportation was separate. I learned a lot, again, from my family. We had a large farm, which they broke up, so that each family, my father had his place, his brothers had his place, his sisters had a place. So I had all these cousins and aunts and uncles, the same location, who had all this experience as well. And the way it worked back in those days, you're that close to all these other family members, you would check out what people are having for supper at every house earlier in the day, and then you make sure you're playing somewhere where there was a good meal that you wanted around supper time. So that's where you'd stay and have your supper. So you get to listen to everybody's story, not just your own family's, to learn what had been happening. So one of the things I learned from my grandmother, who also was on that farm, and she lived to be 98, so she knew a lot of what had happened. If she wanted to make a trip to Baltimore, they used steamships at that time. She was born in the 1890s, but she traveled to Baltimore in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s by steamship. So the white passengers would ride up top, nice sunny days and things. The black passengers were put at the bottom of the steamship, which is where they kept the cargo, all the things going to the market, and also the livestock, any live livestock that they were shipping anywhere. So that's where she had to ride along with the other black passengers. So she, during that time, she made up her mind that her kids and grandkids were going to get as much education as possible, because she felt that was the way out, that you could get away from this system that they were put into by getting a good education. So she worked on that and worked hard on us for all her kids and grandkids to make sure that was instilled in us. So I was at a segregated school, didn't realize how good I had it, because the principal of that segregated school was Harriet Elizabeth Brown. Harriet Elizabeth Brown later became famous. Well, actually, she was famous, but we didn't know that in 1939, she had been responsible for getting equal pay for teachers throughout the state of Maryland. She learned that she was getting $600 a year, and white teachers with this comparable education, teaching the same classes that she was for the white kids, were getting $1,200 a year. And the way the system worked back then is that she didn't have any of her family around her to help her out, to go to and say, will you help me with this? The reason for that is not a lot of people had education in Calvert County, so they had to go out of Calvert County, either to northern states, sometimes to Virginia, to recruit teachers to come to Calvert County. And they put it in the female teachers' contracts that they were not allowed to marry. If they got married, they'd get fired. That was because they wanted these kids to be their family, okay, and not to leave for someone else. So all of my teachers were Miss Brown and Miss Hill and Miss Leak and all of those. I didn't realize that the Miss was because it was in their contract. I thought, you know, again, I'm in elementary school, I just thought teachers were so naturally mean that nobody wanted to marry them. Okay? Janice has taught me otherwise since then. But with that, I didn't realize what they were going through just to teach us, to come there and teach us. There was one particular teacher that had backfired on the county. Her name was Miss Winston, and she came to Calvert County in 1940, and she was teaching math at one of the local segregated schools. She decided she wanted to marry her boyfriend, Mr. Jackson, back in Virginia. They warned her, and she said, that's too bad, I'm getting married, so she left. That Mary Winston became Mary Winston Jackson, who was featured in the movie Hidden Figures. So she became a brilliant mathematician from Nassau, and Calvert County lost that because of their rule about female teachers. It's actually also in the white teachers' contracts, female teachers' contracts, but they were like, well, we've got other options, so who cares? And they would just leave and get married. But the school systems were segregated. I remember our books didn't always have all the pages in it. We got received handy-down books from the white schools. We didn't have the same types of toys, swings, merry-go-rounds, those things out on the playground. There were a lot of rocks on the playgrounds, unlike the white schools that were well kept. So it was not equal, although it was separate. And that's the way it was for me through the 5th grade, okay? Ultimately, when integration came, again, I was so young, 5th grade, I didn't really know the difference. So I didn't have the struggle that Janice and teenagers had when they integrated. I heard stories about it later. Calvert County School, when it was integrated, the high school, some of the people during that time told me things like the football team, the baseball team, they wouldn't play the black players until they started losing so much to other teams that had black players, and that's when they finally started putting them in the game. There were things, they used to have the old parades, homecoming parades, and everybody had these convertible cars. When the black students came, they stopped using the convertibles and they started attaching a trailer to the end of the car and letting the blacks ride behind them on the trailer. So there were things to, I'd say, humiliate people, but not to do it directly to their face, but people knew what was going on. And that caused a lot of the tension that was going on during the initial integration of the school system. But fortunately, we had a lot of dedicated teachers and administrators who worked with it, so I think we have a pretty good system now. We have 4 high schools now, and we don't have a lot of racial tension in those schools. Thank you, Kelsey.
All right, thank you, Michael. Peter, from the Indigenous perspective.
Okay, I'm speaking here today from the Indigenous point of view when it comes to the Civil Rights Act. If you listen to what this gentleman read, everything that the Civil Rights Act was written for was specifically for the African American community. It had nothing to do with us as a people. It did help about this much. We were still segregated to reservations. We still had to have permission to come off the reservations and the time frames that he's talking. Our civil rights really didn't start becoming a subject until the late 60s, early 70s with the American Indian movement. One of my mentors, Dick Gregory, told me that when they used to do a lot of the marches, there was a lot of indigenous people there to help with this fight and how important it is. But we're in 2024. And how do I put this? We as indigenous people are still fighting for our rights. Rights for land, rights for water. This country was founded on religious freedom. The state is founded on religious freedom. We didn't have religious freedom until 1978. To this day, in the state of Maryland, indigenous people do not have a place for us to go to practice our spirituality or our religion, specifically because the state doesn't want us to. So we're still fighting for our civil rights. We still have segregated schools on reservations. I am a victim of that myself. Up until 1980, no, I'm sorry, I think it was the early 90s. I was going to school at American University to get my law degree. And I was told that even though I'm a full-blooded Indian born on a reservation, I have to go back to the reservation college to finish out my degree, that they were no longer going to give me a full ride. They would cut my money by 75% because I'm not going to a school within the state that my tribe's from, or not the college that my tribe falls under land-wise. So to hear them talk about, voting rights. We didn't get voting rights until 1953. And even then, people on reservations weren't allowed to come off the reservations to vote. Today, they are still keeping people on the reservations so that they don't vote. They passed laws that you have to have an address and not a P.O. box for you to be able to register to vote. I don't know how many of you have ever been to a reservation. It's all P.O. boxes. From any reservation west of the Mississippi. You have to go to the post office on the reservation to get your mail. We live on the most desolate pieces of land, and the federal government still wants it back for copper mining, for uranium, for whatever. So we're still fighting for ours. What happened, what he spoke is great. It really is. I don't ever want to see anybody have to go through what my people and their people have had to go through. But our fight still exists today. Here in the state of Maryland, we've been fighting for repatriation, which means having our ancestors give back to us. They won't do it. We've been arguing with the state to have just to have a talk. They won't do it. So I'm proud that things did happen to better one race, but the fight still exists for us. The boarding school system didn't end till 1997. I have a shirt on today that represents murdered and missing women. What is the fastest way to get rid of a people? Kill the women. The laws are written in this country where people can go on the reservation who are not sovereign citizens of that tribe, commit a crime, and not be prosecuted because they're not members of that tribe. So it's a great accomplishment what we're talking about here. My parents were involved in the civil rights movement. My parents were original members of American Indian movement. And it's a big fight. And all we want is people to listen.
Thank you.
And I'll end with that.
Turning back to our esteemed panel, would like to get your insights on some of the key achievements in dismantling legal segregation and discrimination, and how these have influenced subsequent legislation.
I'm sorry, repeat that.
Couldn't hear that either.
Sorry about that. Would like to get your insight on some key achievements of the Civil Rights Act and dismantling legal segregation and discrimination. You've kind of touched on that, with education, but could you go a little further?
Yes, and that's for me.
Well, if you want, Dr. Dennis?
You go first.
Well, you mentioned your parents were very much involved in the Civil Rights Act, and my parents were, especially my dad, Fred Talbert, and he was very much involved with the public accommodations, and here, the local NAACP, and they even started something they called the Civics Association to support the NAACP, and the Public Accommodations Act was passed, I think, in 1963 in the state of Maryland. Yay, Maryland. But here locally, what they did, my father and other people involved in the act, they went around and decided to desegregate the restaurants and the movie theaters, and just to go, and it wasn't like a sit-in, but they just went into different spots, like Rexall drugstore that we used to have here, brought people in and sat at the counters and got served. They went to the theater. Now, right here in Lexington Park, there was a street called Tulagi Place, which was very much, it was, when the base first started, this is where they started to building up the community around the base. And most of the stores right on Tulagi Place were, integrated. You could go to the store, but right across the street, there was a movie theater called the Plaza. and they didn't even allow you in that. Black people couldn't even go in that movie theater. And but down the street from that was a theater called the Park Theater. You had to go in the side doors and go upstairs in the balcony. But at the Plaza Theater, you were not allowed. So the group went to, my father said, we went to see Old Harrison, and we went in there, and he said, come on in, guys, you all come on in, because money is green. It's not black or white. So they did manage to integrate the Plaza Theater, but they went to Leonardtown to Duke's restaurant. Didn't have very much luck there. But of course the laws were passed and they had to eventually open the doors. So, and that was all going on right here in St. Mary's County. Actually, even in the churches, you would go in church, you know, I belong to the Catholic Church, and blacks sat in the back in some parts of the county. I grew up for about 10 years living in Lexington Park in a place called Carver Heights, which was the separate but equal, I guess, that is how the naval base did things back then. They had the segregated system. They built Carver Heights for the civil service workers and military folks that wanted the base housing outside the base. And they had another place that we called it the Flat Tops for the white community, base community. And the black base community was Carver Heights. And we had the Reynolds place, we had a USO, we had a community group, we had a town green, all in Carver Heights. But my father, and again, was very active in the civil rights movement, and he would really give us the opportunity to get involved. He was in the NAACP, would take us to meetings. They had a place they called it Leonardtown Alley Park Avenue, but that's where black folks met. That's where the NAACP met. And we would go to meetings with him and sit in the back and, you know, kind of pay attention to what's going on, what was going on in the community. But so there were people doing things in the community, especially with public accommodations. And he even went to Annapolis to, you know, lobby for the act to pass.
I guess I'll just add, in terms of thinking about the legacy, as I move a little north, but still in Southern Maryland, but to talk about Prince George's County is looking at the political landscape and looking at the importance of this legislation on expanding the franchise for the African American community. And so, looking, of course, today we have an African American woman from Prince George's County, our county executive, who's running for the Senate. And so we look back and look at the groundwork that was laid following the Civil Rights Act to create that to be able to happen today. And not only that we have our first African American governor in Wes Moore. And so looking at the building up of this political legacy, the building up of voting rights, which was made possible by this legislation, but there was, of course, many decades of work that happened before that, and as is mentioned here, there's still a lot of ways to go, and so we still need to do continual work, but definitely looking at the ways in which this legislation opened doors for more African Americans to not only to vote, but then to vote into office, people that look like them. And so we can look at not only on the county level, we can look at who's in the state house, we can look at who are the town council members and the people who are heads of different municipalities. And so having people at all levels is important. Having that representation at all levels is important. And so thinking about that being an important legacy of this legislation.
On the Public Accommodations Act, my grandparents and other family members supported that. Calvert was one of the last, or the last county to ratify it. As far as the things Janice was talking about, the bars, they grew corn on the farm and made their own liquor, so they could care less about that. But what they found was that they didn't have much pressure to put on the state government about the public accommodations, although they did want that. The people that put pressure on them was the federal government, because they had so many embassies in Washington, D.C., and the ambassadors living in Washington, D.C., for the most part, were black and brown people from black and brown countries. And on weekends, they would get bored like anyone else, and they would want to come ride in the country and see what was out there. But it was not a pleasant trip for them to come south when they were prevented from coming into these locations. So that was the pressure that was put on Maryland to pass the Public Accommodations Act, because the fear was, if we do this to the people from these countries, what are they going to do to our people that are over in their countries? And that's how it ultimately got passed, just fear of what might happen to white people over in black and brown countries.
I 100% agree with what you say on how it's really opened up a lot of things for people of color, and to allow them to really move up in the structure that the United States is, from congressmen to Senate to vice president to all the positions that are being held. And it's so beautiful to see the different backgrounds and cultures of these people, because if you come from the South, it's one way. If you come from the Midwest, it's another way. If you come over this way. Because when we moved here, let's see, we left the reservation in '73, and South Tucson, just where the reservation that I'm from, was horrible for us as a people. We moved out here because my dad found a better job. Things were a lot more segregated. I mean, they were desegregated in the aspect that we were going to school with different colored people and everything and all that. And I remember telling my mom, I said, "Mom, what, there's other people here darker than we are." You know, and she goes, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Because there are." You know, and it was such a surprise, and, you know, having friends from different backgrounds, and growing up that way, instead of growing up on a reservation where I'm just surrounded by people that look like me. I think that gives me such a huge advantage when it comes to when I'm able to talk about this subject, because I've seen it from my own people's point of view. And then getting involved in the American Indian movement as young as I did, having Dick Gregory as a mentor, having other people like Spike Moss from up out of Minnesota really talk to me about what it meant for these African American men to help natives in their fight, and how it can really work for everybody if we push the same way. Of course, we pushed it a little differently, but it's huge what they're talking about. I mean, think about it. Having to go to school in some place that the roof leaked, or there was no bathroom, or I can't even think of that, you know. The worst thing I can tell you is that I know that one time when we were in a restaurant, somebody asked, "Why are those people here?" And my dad got up and told them, "We're here to eat." And I just kind of looked at him, and I didn't question it until later why they asked that. But it really makes a difference to be able to see the growth in the community for people of color.
I just wanted to mention also, and when considering the military and their involvement in making sure that race relations were a part of what they did, and thinking about today, but my dad, again, was a shop steward for the union, and people would come and bring him their concerns and all, and they had a system for, you know, solving problems. But they also had race relations courses. I mean, just like we're doing today, you know, where people can come and get the training you need or the information you need. And but they traveled. He and another group of people, he talked about these people, they would go and they had their workshops and trainings. They were the coordinators or the trainers back in the 70s. And that was about 3 years, again, after they desegregated schools in St. Mary's County. So they had been moving forward with a lot of the programs for, dismantling racism.
Yeah, just a little bit on the legacy in terms of federal legislation. I don't think without the Civil Rights Act of '64, you get the momentum that carries into 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and Title IX of the Education Amendments in 1972 and the American with Disabilities Act 1990 or 91, whenever it was, and on up until the Marriage Equality Act, much more recent times, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. I think in some ways all of those really significant pieces of federal legislation kind of flow from the Civil Rights Act of '64.
And that takes us into our next question, actually, which is, in what ways do you believe the spirit still is relevant in addressing contemporary racial and social justice issues? And you touched on equal pay, you touched on same-sex marriage. Is there anything else that you would like to bring forth?
So how does it still need to be expanded some as far as the Civil Rights Act, some more things they need to look at? There still is a disparity, I think, in the military. Initially, during the Vietnam era, or even before that, all the records from Calvert County suddenly disappeared when we were looking for them to see who was drafted. 'Cause back then, pretty much, if you went to Vietnam, you weren't coming back. So when I was going around searching for memorabilia from different people, I found, well, I sold this, I gave this away when I was drafted, because it seemed like so many more black people went to Vietnam than whites did, because the death toll was so high there. I joined the military, the Navy, after the Vietnam era. Actually, they didn't even want me in because they had so many people that had been drafted in. By the time I came in 1977, they were actively trying to get people out, senior people out that were making a lot of money. They wanted to get them out. But it still stayed the same as far as who was getting the promotions. You had to know what you were doing, take a test to advance. I started as a reservist, so I was still in school. So, and I was working initially enlisted as a signalman, which is the ones that know the Morse code, the flashing lights and things like that to communicate with other ships. And I could never pass the test because I didn't have a chance to practice enough to be proficient in that. So ultimately I said, well, forget this, and I took the test to be an officer. You don't have to know how to do anything to be an officer. So I passed that. I passed that and became an ensign. But even with that, just the disparities, how many officers you have in the military, as looking at how the enlisted ranks are. And at one point they tried to change the test so that you didn't have to get as high a score if you were a person of color as the whites had to get in order to get the commission to be an officer. And eventually somebody sued over that, so they stopped that disparity. Everyone had to get the same score in order to be to advance as an officer. But there still is a large disparity between the enlisted people and the officers in the military.
Would anyone else want to comment on that? Would anyone else want to comment?
Yeah. I remember my mom telling me, my dad telling me, the reason why they moved here is for economics. Because where we lived on the reservation, if your address was on the reservation, you made half of what if you didn't. If you claimed that you were an Indian, you may make $23,000 a year. If you claimed to be Mexican, you may make $28,000 a year. If you were white, you were making $30,000, $40,000 a year. And in '73, in the '70s, that was a lot of money. So that's the reason why my parents moved us here. But in talking about civil rights and all that kind of stuff today, one of the questions I get asked a lot is if I'm a real Indian. And I laugh at people when they ask me that question. I go, yeah, I'm real. Okay, and well, no, I thought you guys were all dead. That's the problem. Because you heard me talk about repatriation and other things in our community. Everybody thinks we're dead, or everybody looks upon us as not human. I want to go back to the Constitution of the United States. We're the merciless savages. Hundreds of years later, during the Indian Wars west of the Mississippi, the so-called great generals of this country called us less than dogs and fed their dogs better than they did us. They tried to starve us to death. But we're still here. And when people question my authenticity of who I am, I've had to turn it into a joke. I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to beg the state of Maryland to give us a place where we can go and hold our ceremonies. I shouldn't have to prove to anybody who I am. And that's what we have to do every day as indigenous people of the United States. I have a card in my wallet, like I'm a breeding horse, that tells how much percentage of blood I have. We're talking civil rights here. Again, I am going to say what happened with the Civil Rights Act from one time to the next are beautiful acts, because it's allowed what happens in this country today to happen. But there's still a fight that needs to be fought. And we're not going to be able to do it by ourselves, because we are the smallest voice in our own country. I have taken on the responsibility of being part of that voice, and also being the voice of the ones that no longer speak. Every child matters, murdered and missing. Our ancestors that are in museums or in warehouses that need to be put back into the ground. All these are civil rights violations. They won't go through a cemetery and dig up things, but they'll do it to us in a heartbeat. I hate to keep raining down on what we're talking about here, but I need everybody to understand something. Our fight still continues. For everybody that sits here, okay, I make 5 times the amount of money my dad did at this age because I'm in law enforcement. But my dad had to put up with, oh, you're an Indian, we can't hire you. Or your hair is too long. I've even gotten that working in law enforcement. Well, you have long hair, you have to get cut. No, I don't. 1978, Religious Freedom Act. Look it up. Well, we're not going to hire you then. Cool, then I'll just sue you in federal court. And then they find another reason why they have to let me go. So everything that these people were talking about up here still happens today. And not just to the indigenous people. It still happens in the African American community. It still happens in the Asian community. It still happens in the Hispanic community. It still happens, it still happens, it still happens. There's a lot of things that we need to still do as a country. And this is just the beginning, a great beginning. but more needs to be done.
Which kind of takes us into our next question, which is, how should the history and significance of the Civil Rights Act be taught in schools to ensure that future generations understand its importance and continued legacy? That's the first portion of it.
Can you read that again? For some reason, I am not hearing you as well.
All right. How should the history and significance of the Civil Rights Act be taught in schools to ensure the future generations understand its importance and continue its legacy?
Okay. Of course, civic education is very important, I believe, that it be a part of, a mandated curriculum. I think that schools, especially public schools, are microcosms of society. And if you look at what's going on in your community, what's happening in your community, then you know what you need to teach in your schools. So the whole idea of civic education, I mean, people thinking, oh yes, I can vote, I can choose to vote, or I don't know, those people do what they want to do anyway. That's what you get, They're going to do what they want to do anyway, so I don't need to do that. I need to go shopping, or I need to go to the, to have a fancy meal, or to go to the casinos, and have a good time, because that's not part of what I want to get involved in. But they don't really understand how important their vote is, and what they have to say is to continuing our democracy. And we see it today, how what's going on, where people are not involved, or don't think they should be involved or can be. And I really think it begins in school. I often think about the kids, and people say, well, where are the parents? Well, those are some of the parents that we're talking about that don't see their place in society, in the democracy, and in making change and being a part of change. But it's not the kids' fault. So, and it's, oh, well, you're putting everything on the schools. So, yeah, so let's have a year-round school. Let's change to meet the needs of society. Let's look at mandating financial literacy, because obviously if you can't afford to buy eggs, but you can get on the plane and fly everywhere you want, and pack the roads for the holidays, you must be getting some money from somewhere to do what you want to do, unless you're getting those credit cards, built up again. So, so there are certain things that you cannot leave out of your curriculum. Let's look at character education or social skills development. Okay, if everybody's shooting them up with guns and they think that's how to solve the problems in 2024, then you need some type of a course or information to these students about conflict resolution. So is Algebra 1 just as important as conflict resolution in 2024? So you've got to weigh, how you treat people. And I was an elementary school teacher and principal, and I would always tell the children, I said, if you treat people the way you want to be treated, 99% of the time, you're going to be treated right. I'm not going to say all of the, that 1% would be there, but those kinds of lessons need to be learned, and we need to really assess where we are in the community. Our community is different from the community next door, from Calvert, or so, and really understand what we need, and what the kids need, and what the community needs.
And I think you made a very important point when thinking about not just including this information in the curriculum, but also I think we need to think about what changes we need to make in order to teach a new generation. So we're operating off of old models. This is what worked, or we thought it worked in the past, and we're going to keep doing this and doing this. But we really have to think about what day and age that we're in, what technology is available, what technology kids are using, and think about how do we create a new curriculum that meets where we are, 2024, and incorporates this important information. And as someone who works in museums, what we see all the time is that kids, history, they start to glaze over, they get that vacant look. But if you are able to connect that past to the present, that's when you get those aha moments. That's when you get people really thinking about, oh, okay, I understand why this is important. And I think not enough of that is done. So as we're thinking about how do we change the delivery and the structure of our curriculum, I'm also thinking about how are we making sure that we're always connecting that past to present, how they understand like these rights that people were fighting for. These struggles are still continuing today. I spent all of yesterday with people talking about gerrymandering and like how that's depriving people of political rights and voting rights. And so, making those connections I think is very critical as we think about how we teach our young people and infuse this into our curriculum.
So I would just add that another way of teaching other than in the classroom is through our museums and through places like Sotterley Plantation. I guess 10, 15 years ago, you could go to any museum in Calvert County, Jefferson Patterson Park, or Calvert Marine Museum, or the Bayside Museum over the beach, and you'd never know that a black person ever lived in Calvert County. There were never any exhibits or anything, either by the black population or about the black population. So I've been working with them for years to get exhibits into these museums, and we're finally getting that done. And to go with what Mark was saying, you have to let people know what's going on today. There's a lot of erosion going on in Calvert County, especially around and they're doing archaeology work around old Calvert County, the old government seat. So a lot of the shoreline is washing away and bones are being turned up. So whenever they do the work on it and find out that it was a black person, I get contacted about that, and then I get the opportunity to check with a black church that was in the area to see if they're willing to rebury that person at that location. If Native American bones turn up, you're not notified. They ship those down to Jefferson Patterson Park, and they are boxed up.
Yeah, we can go on hours on that subject. But my parents told me at a really young age, if you're going to be in the fight, know the history. Because if you can't speak of the history, how are you supposed to go forward? So, the first thing that should happen is never be satisfied with the status quo. Have a voice. Always have a voice. Be willing to stand for what's right, period. Whether it's for your community, other communities, it doesn't make a difference. I look back, there are days that I drop my head and I go, why am I doing this? But then I think back, Malcolm X had many of those days. Dr. King had many of those days. Russell Means had many of those days. Dennis Banks had many of those days. Those are two Native activists who helped. And I can keep going on and on and on and on. Draw strength from the past so that we could change the future. And never keep quiet when there's an injustice.
Chuck, did you want to chime in on the educational portion?
I am in a classroom, but one of the things that I think the college is able to offer is I teach a semester-long course on the civil rights movement, and the first day of class, we talk about, well, when does it begin, right? And of course, 1619 is a pretty good place to start, right? But as the college, we have history classes, we have, professors teaching African American literature and poetry, we have African Diaspora Studies minor, right? So the classroom experience is important, right? But but also looking for those opportunities to kind of get out of the sort of conventional classroom experience. I teach a first-year seminar to their first semester students, and it's on Lincoln, but what it really is on the struggle to end slavery, right? They don't know that necessarily the first day of class when they sign up for a class on Lincoln. And one of the things we do is we'll meet out at the commemorative, and I have them go to a database that the Maryland State Archives has of runaway slaves. And I say, pick one, right? And it's it's usually like a newspaper account of, so-and-so has run away and looks like this and so forth. And I say, just pick one. And when we meet at the commemorative, just share it with the class, right? And so first I go and I kind of explain about the commemorative. I give a very, very brief kind of overview of the arrival of enslaved people coming off the river, literally, right, in the 1630s. And then they share their story with us. And I always ask them, why'd you pick that one? And the students' response is just, it's really powerful, because a lot of times they'll say, well, this is my home, this is from my home county, right? And that's kind of that, making that connection is, or it might be, this was, I noticed that they ran away on Christmas. It's like, okay, why do you think that was, right? And it gets us to talk about, the life of the enslaved, that Christmas was usually, a holiday. And well, they knew that. They knew that there wasn't going to be anybody looking over their shoulder that day, and so off they go, right? So just being able to use what the college has in terms of the course offerings and what we have on our campus to try and make those connections, lift them out of the textbook, so to speak.
Very good. And based on what we're doing tonight, it kind of gives it into this question, is what can be done to increase public awareness and understanding of the Civil Rights Act's impacts and ongoing relevance, other than having discussions like this?
I'm going to say educate yourself, and not just from one point of view. You have to know multiple point of views so that when you stand, you know what you're standing on. Every inch of land from the Atlantic to the Pacific is indigenous people's land. I know what I stand on because I learned my history. My parents drilled it into me. Know your history, know your history. Not just as a Yaqui, but as an indigenous man. No African American history, no Asian history, no Hispanic history, because you're going to need this in your day-to-day life in the fight that comes before you.
I think that drawing from the past, what you just said, draw strength from the past, and the Civil Rights Acts have been presented ever since 1866. Now, if we haven't begun to really understand the need in 2024, then we're all in trouble. Because we can look at what's happened in the past and see how things have evolved. In every area that we've talked about, there's been some sort of, committee or group that's responsible for making sure that these policies and regulations are being carried out. But these groups fizzle out. Today, we have in the public schools, we have an equity in education policy, but they're really trying to get parents involved. And we've been on task force. I have the task force for equity in education, and all of these kinds of programs are there. I talked about my father and, doing the activities that he did for civil rights and trainings and all of those. But again, they fizzle out And I think that, you know, what is the sign of the times or the flavor of the day? So those things have to be really incorporated in everything we do in our schools and in our communities to make sure that those kinds of programs don't fizzle out because we're at a point where they might. So I think that's very important, to look at those kind of policies and get people involved in understanding what's going on. You do the measurements, the data. Once you do the data and you look at, say, like in St. Mary's County Public Schools, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, everybody here was, back in the 70s, and bringing in African-American teachers. And once they went south and got the teachers, nobody bothered to continue keep the momentum going. And you looked, and we fizzle out to 6% of the population. It's African-American teachers. I think it might be up a little bit now, about 13%, but you have to have it built into the structure. Someone, even back in the day, when the civil rights movement again started here, we had a man, Mr. Norman Moore. He was basically the equity person. He taught me in high school, and he continued on in that role of making sure people were, that teachers were brought in, that, you know, the equity was part of what was going on in the school system. Now, when you look at those roles and responsibilities, you look at diversity in staffing, you look at the administrators in the school system, if someone doesn't speak up and speak out about following the regulations and policies, then we're not drawing from the past.
I've had success in talking about not just the struggles that people had, but the success that they were able to derive from those struggles. So we've recreated a one-room schoolhouse, and we have 8th graders come in there. All the 8th grade classes of Calvert County at one point or another will go through that one-room schoolhouse. And I tell them about the Bourne family that were down in the lower part of Calvert County. Ulysses Grant Bourne, his family were enslaved. He came from that family. They wanted to make sure he succeeded, so they paid for him to go to school in Baltimore. After he received his 7th grade education at the one-room schoolhouse, he went up to Baltimore to Frederick Douglass High School. He went on from there to become the first licensed black doctor in the state of Maryland in 1902. And when they hear 1902 out of Calvert County with a 7th grade education, not only did he become the licensed doctor, he went to Frederick County and opened a hospital. He opened a 15-room hospital in Frederick County that was named after him. His younger brother, James Franklin Bourne, and Kelsey is familiar with that name, he went to Delaware, became a pharmacist, but he was able to use the money from the pharmacy to send James Franklin Bourne Jr. back here to Maryland, and James Franklin Bourne Jr. now has part of the courthouse in Upper Marlboro named after him. He was the first black judge in Montgomery and Prince George's County. And the Black Bar Association is also named after him, the James Franklin Bourne Bar Association. Again, 2 guys with a 7th grade education from Calvert County, but said we can do better, and they kept going. Another young man that I tell them about, N.M. Carroll, Mr. Carroll, was enslaved in the 1850s, and he bought his way out of slavery. He worked a second job. Slavery wasn't enough for him, so he took a second job on weekends and earned enough money to buy his freedom and his father's freedom. And then he went to Baltimore, still an industrious young man, and in the 1880s he opened the first senior housing, an old folks home in Baltimore, because no one had anything to do with old people. They were just living on the street because there was no retirement, no Social Security. He opened an old folks home, and when you go to Baltimore now, heading towards the Inner Harbor, you'll still see his name, N.M. Carroll Manor and N.M. Carroll Senior Housing, all along that route. And he did that, again, in the 1880s, but he was one of the first to do it, again, from Calvert County, so they recognized him for that. And the final example I give them is who our Board of Education is named after now, William Sampson Brooks, W.S. Brooks, born in Calvert in 1865, one-room education, one-room schoolhouse education from the Carroll School down in Adelina in Prince Frederick. He went up to Baltimore, and he was one of the first graduates from Morgan State. college, became again an Episcopal minister and bishop, and then he started churches throughout the country and in Africa. And he was so popular in the 1930s when he died in 1934 that they gave him funerals, 4 funerals in 4 different states. And they played them on the radio so that everybody could hear about him. And of course, they forgot about him now. That's why I have to remind people of what he did and how popular he was, William Sampson Brooks. But people are amazed and said, well, just with the 7th grade education from a one-room schoolhouse, and they were able to achieve all of these things when they had so many things against them.
I guess to add to that, to what's already been said, I would say in order to have more success, one big thing we've talked a lot about education is investment in education. And that's not to say just throwing money at education is going to solve all our problems, but we do know that teachers are underpaid, that we do know that there's not enough investment in our public school system. So investing in those systems so that there are these opportunities for young people to learn about this at a young age, so that this is a part of their entire educational experience. And just providing the teachers with the resources they need so that we don't have teachers burning out and the best qualified teachers leaving because they're so fed up and frustrated with the state of the educational system and the lack of compensation that they receive. So that's very key. Definitely I agree with this idea, of balance in telling these narratives is so important. People don't necessarily want to come in and just be beat down all the time with the history of their own people, but they also want to hear about joy. They want to hear about success. So having balance in telling these narratives is also, I think, very important. And then lastly, having programs like this is great, but also getting out of these traditional spaces and getting into more non-traditional spaces, meeting people where they are to have these types of discussions, whether they be panels, whether they be one-on-one conversations, getting out of the halls of academia, going to community centers, going to churches, where people are so that they get that information. And once again, getting that information from a young age so that, they have that as they get into their formative years.
So the continued growth process, which kind of takes us to this question, which is, what role should federal, state, and local governments play in the continuing the work initiated by the Civil Rights Act?
Well, for me, they should supply the money. We can give them the expertise, give us the money to work with.
Well, using the system that they have, for instance, what has happened to the Human Relations Commissions? There are county commissions, and we have a Human Relations Commission. I assume they meet, but that is a way to really make sure that the message is heard and that the policies are known and what the county is doing about it. The county administrators, the county commissioners, they do have programs. And getting, like you said, the more traditional, getting out of certain spaces and taking those kinds of programs into spaces where people are so that they will know what is going on and so that they will be heard about what their issues still are in terms of civil rights. So I think that's very important. And the county and the national, state, and local governments, especially local, because sometimes they don't see that as a role. Everything is back to the federal government and what they're not doing or are doing. And of course, we do need that. We do definitely need that, but we need the responsibilities right here locally is to continue to move forward.
I think that the federal government and the state government need to remember that the people who put them there in power, and not just the big donors and people gave them all the money and everything and all that, because if they thought about the little people or the people that have the hardest time or the, you know, I mean, look at some of the neighborhoods in DC and Baltimore. Look at the reservation system. It's horrible. But the people who sit in the state and the federal government, it's like they have blinders on. They don't see it. I think we as a people need to start holding them a little more accountable for what they don't do instead of what they do. It's great that they've passed bills to do this and do that, but here lately, they haven't even funded the government for less than a couple months. Why are they still sitting in the positions that they're in? Be a voice, get out and vote. Hold people accountable for what they don't do as much as what they do. Just because somebody talks a good game, and if they don't produce, get them out of there. So the federal government helps out a whole lot, and so does the state, like the gentleman was talking about with money. Or even helping to suggest that you guys can go here and look for it, or over here and look for it, or whatever. But there's some factions of the community they won't even talk to. Why do we have homeless vets? As much money as we spend on foreign wars, if we turned that into homeless vets, we wouldn't have any homeless veterans. I'm not even talking about my own community here. I'm just talking about veterans, period. The housing crisis can be solved if people would put their mind to it and do something about it. So if the federal government and the state government is really going to get involved, even when it comes to civil rights, uphold what you've already written. And it says, we the people. That should include all people, irregardless of income, race, religion, or national background.
Okay, our final question for the evening is, what do you hope will happen in the next 60 years regarding the progress and advancement in civil rights and equity? I saved the best for last.
Well, I hope in the next 60 years that we'll be looking at utopia in our state and in our communities, to have a vision for what we hope to be, being hopeful about the future, and that in the next 60 years we will have the equity and civil rights and all of these things that are happening in today's world will be a thing of the past, and that our communities will be united and connected to each other, that we will be able to, talk together, work together, and that we will have the type of democracy in which we cannot have leaders or folks coming in trying to tear us apart because of our differences. And that's, things that's happening in the world today. Find the difference. That's how slavery was started. What can I say? How can I make this person different from you so that you'll think you are better than they are? And the only thing they could find was the color of the skin. So those differences, I'm hoping that in the next 60 years that has to change. And that our youth will be then taking the seats that they need to take to move us forward, that we have changed with the times, as which we've talked about, and that we are doing things considering youth and youth involvement and not just sliding into the next generation, that we have a plan for, generational movement and what's needed in our schools. We talked about that earlier. What's needed in our communities, and that the education will fulfill the needs of the community, of the state, of the nation. and that it won't be a fight for power, a power struggle. It'll be a community needs come first, the needs of the people.
My goal is to be here for a large part of that 60 years. Our family record for age is 107, so I'm shooting for 110. And with that, you know, everybody's scattered all over the place now and talking to grandparents and great-grandparents via Zoom. So when we have these family reunions every couple of years, I try to convert at least one little egghead into being a historian for the family, because I think that's the way it keeps going. If you just keep passing along in your family, then hopefully eventually somebody will pass it outside of the family, and that way the education will continue. Thank you.
As someone who is pro-egghead and pro-historian, I hope, I appreciate that, I like that, yeah. I guess that my hope would be that as a historian, that 60 years from now, students will read about an event like this and a topic like this, and it will be seen as history.
I think we can end it on that. I think that was very poignant. So please give a round of applause to our wonderful panel. And I have to say, I truly appreciate all of you for being out here this evening. Even with the fire alarm going off. Just go home tonight and exercise your civil rights by watching the VP debate. So if you're still have the energy to stay up for 90 minutes. So with that, thank you, travel safe, have a wonderful evening.